A mystery that cannot be explained. An enigma that defies reason. A surprising and unexpected answer. To encounter such a mystery firsthand may change your life forever. Face to face with the greatest riddles of the ages, the world's most profound mysteries reach out and touch your life in ways you never imagined possible. Extreme Mysteries.
Two of the world's great religions, Christianity and Judaism, base many of their beliefs, even their geopolitical systems, on events and declarations from Mount Sinai. The historic record dates back thousands of years, kept by believers and non-believers alike. Why is it then that nobody seems to know exactly where Mount Sinai is? Is there a real mountain that holds the secrets of God's interaction with man? Is this the actual burning bush on the slope of Mount Sinai where God first spoke to Moses? Were the tablets of the Ten Commandments literally carved by the finger of God into stone from this mountain? And if this is the real Mount Sinai, why has the Saudi Arabian government erected a chain-link fence and closed down all geological and archaeological studies of this mountain in the ancient land of Midian? The sons of Isaac and the sons of Ishmael have been at war for over 4,000 years, and today's headlines demonstrate that, if anything, the situation is getting worse. Could it be that the ancient mountain of Moses will once again be crucial to the very survival of Israel? Since the 4th century A.D., a high mountain near the southern end of the Sinai Peninsula, officially labeled Jebel Musa, has been regarded by many faithful Christians as the Mount Sinai. But is it?
The priest scribes who wrote the 5 books of the Bible attributed to Moses could not even decide on whether the sacred mountain of Moses was named Sinai or Horeb. 37 times it's called Sinai, and 17 times it's called Horeb.
While the mountain on which Moses received the 10 Commandments is called alternately Sinai or Horeb in the Scriptures, there is little difficulty in explaining this apparent contradiction. During King David's reign, 2 versions of the same scripture were brought together in a manner that allowed both northern and southern Israelite tribes to keep their familiar identifiers for geographic places. Sinai and Horeb are the same mountain. Nothing in the Bible suggests that they are not.
St. Catherine's Monastery, located at the base of the mountain, was constructed by order of the Emperor Justinian between 527 and 565 A.D. It is built around what is thought by those who inhabit the monastery and many in the surrounding area to be the bush that Moses saw burning but not consumed. By order of Queen Helena, mother of the Emperor Constantine, a chapel was built over this very bush centuries ago. This monastery is in fact a spectacular natural setting for the second largest collection of illustrated manuscripts in the world, a collection exceeded only by the Vatican's. The monastery also houses a vast collection of priceless works of art, including Arab mosaics, Greek and Russian icons, Western oil paintings, paintings on wax, fine sacerdotal ornaments, marbles, enamels, chalices, reliquaries, including one donated by Tsar Alexander II in the 19th century, and another by Empress Catherine of Russia in the 17th century. In 1850, the 4th century Codex Sinaiticus was discovered here and taken to the British Museum. But if so many generations of rulers, priests, and kings are satisfied with this Mount Sinai, what is it that makes today's scholars and investigators turn their attention to a mountain in Saudi Arabia called Jebel el-Lawz?
None of the suggested sites in the Sinai Peninsula fit the biblical requirements. The traditional site, called Jebel Musa, and located near St. Catherine's Monastery, fails all of the historical, geographic, and archaeological tests.
perhaps we should take a moment to discover exactly what these tests are and how they can be applied some 4,000 years after the fact.
Asplod, get to work!
To summarize the story briefly, a young Moses, raised as an Egyptian prince, was forced to flee into the desert to escape the wrath of Pharaoh after he killed an Egyptian overseer who was beating a Hebrew slave. Eventually, he came into the camp of a Midianite priest named Jethro, who was wealthy in both daughters and livestock. Moses married one of Jethro's daughters, Zipporah, and settled down to what he thought would be the life of a shepherd. But it was not to be. One day, while grazing his flock on the slopes of Mount Sinai, he encountered a marvelous sight. A bush suddenly burst into flame, but it was not consumed, and out of the burning bush, Moses heard the voice of God.
I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
The life of Moses would never be the same. The Lord told him to return to Egypt and bring the Hebrews out of bondage. This was to be the great exodus out of Egypt and into the Promised Land. The story of the burning bush, as well as other miracles performed by Moses in his effort to get the Pharaoh to release the Hebrew slaves, has been the cause of a great deal of skepticism over the centuries, and many critics question whether there ever was a massive exodus out of the land of Egypt.
Using the lowest estimate for men, women, and children that supposedly were a part of the Exodus, the count would run over 2 million people, plus their livestock. If they were placed on a modern 4-lane highway, the line of march would cover the road from edge to edge for 150 miles. If all these Hebrews wandered the Sinai desert for 40 years under Exodus, where is the archaeological evidence of their passage? The Exodus never happened the way it's described in the Bible.
The biblical story of the Exodus is an eyewitness account written by a layman to his contemporaries. Although the writer was not a scholarly historian, there are enough historical kernels indicating that the account is factual from both an archaeological and Egyptian anthropological perspective. The account contains sufficient place names cross-referenced in non-biblical Sumerian and Assyrian cuneiform tablets to confirm the accuracy of the Exodus account, and to assure scholars that it was not an account invented for later consumption. Certain features of the Exodus narrative accurately reflect unique Sinaitic geographic features which only a person who spent time there would ever know.
God, thy will be done.
Few places mentioned in the Bible are as important to the people of that book as Mount Sinai. Virtually every major event associated with the Exodus somehow involves this holy mountain. That being the case, certain identifying characteristics are required by the biblical account that can help us pinpoint the location of Mount Sinai. But what are they?
First, it had to be located in ancient Media, which is in present-day Saudi Arabia. Secondly, on the backside of the mountain there must be a vast desert, as you see here. Thirdly, it must be located completely outside of Egypt and its controlled territories, which would exclude the Sinai Peninsula. None of the other proposed mountain sites fits all these requirements except Jebel El Lawz.
But if that's true, how did Jebel Musa and the site of St. Catherine's Monastery get such a hold on the popular and scholarly imagination?
Unknown to most people, the Jebel Musa site was selected solely on the opinion of one man, or perhaps we should say one man's mother. The Roman Emperor Constantine the Great sent his mother Helena to the Middle East to discover spots he had seen in visions. The fact is, there was not the slightest biblical or historical evidence to sustain the selection of this site as a proper place for the giving of the law. In fact, just the opposite was the case. Yet not too surprisingly, Constantine's command prevailed, and Helena ordered a church built on the spot where 4th century Bedouins said they had found the burning bush. What we must understand is that Mount Sinai in the Sinai Peninsula was selected without any scientific or archaeological evidence being considered.
There doesn't seem to be any firm Jewish tradition that supports Constantine's site either. In fact, the Jewish Encyclopedia states flatly that there is no Jewish tradition of the geographical location of Mount Sinai. But that also means there is no Jewish tradition that supports the site in Saudi Arabia. What is it that points scholars toward this site?
The earliest Jewish source, other than the Torah, that discusses the location of Mount Sinai is the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, begun in the 3rd century BC. The Septuagint transliterates the Hebrew name for Midian as either Midian or Medium. The Septuagint states that Jethro was a priest of Midian, who went out and then went into the desert to meet Moses. Apparently the translators believed that Jethro lived in a city named Midian, and that he had to leave the city in order to meet Moses. The location of ancient Midian can be determined from a map produced by Ptolemy, a 2nd century AD geographer in Alexandria. Because the translators had a specific city in mind when they identified the hometown of Jethro, and because the account in Exodus of the meeting between Moses and Jethro places Mount Sinai close to Jethro's home, it seems likely that Horeb, or Mount Sinai, was a particular mountain not far from the city of Midian.
And the Septuagint is not alone in placing the mountain near a city in modern-day Saudi Arabia. Demetrius the chronographer in the 3rd century BC claims that after Moses married Zipporah, they made their home in the city of Madian. And Philo, a Jewish philosopher, describes Zipporah as an Arab who lived in Arabia. He describes the Israelites wandering eastward all the way across the Sinai Peninsula to the southern edge of Palestine just before the revelation at Sinai. Philo thus places Mount Sinai somewhere in northwestern Arabia. Philo adds one more small detail to the investigation of Mount Sinai. He says that Moses went up the highest and most sacred of the mountains in its region. But it is the Apostle Paul who provides the finishing touch. In Galatians 4:25, he says, "Now Hagar stands for Mount Sinai in Arabia." Where does that leave Jebel Musa, or the present Mount Sinai? Since 1956, archaeological teams have searched for evidence that Moses and the Israelites once camped here for nearly a year after their flight from Egypt.
When the Sinai Peninsula was under Israeli control, they discovered nothing. Out of over 8,000 inscriptions from the southern half of the Sinai Peninsula, only a handful are Hebrew Aramaic. The tradition of identifying one of the mountains in the Sinai Peninsula as the Mountain of Moses was a scholar's invention, without any Jewish precedence whatsoever. No Jews were ever interested in the Sinai Peninsula, with any respect anyway to Moses.
Traditions, particularly religious traditions, die hard. The Mount Sinai, located near the monastery of St. Catherine, is now anchored in 1,600 years of tradition, and those who are devoted to this site show little interest in looking elsewhere. Is there some scientific evidence that proves Jebel el-Lawz in northwestern Saudi Arabia is in fact the true Mount Sinai? What is there besides just the location to suggest this mountain was once the place where God communicated directly with Moses? Has anyone actually been there to see and catalog the evidence? And what does the Saudi government think of all this newfound attention? The exciting and surprising answers when we come back. Most of the places mentioned in Exodus are unknown. Scholars and investigators are still searching for the point at which the children of Israel might have crossed the Red Sea. No one knows where they might have first set foot in Sinai, and the location of the mystical Mount Sinai itself is the subject of relentless argument. Lately, however, modern technology has begun to have an impact on the discussion. Infrared satellite photography, for example, is helping to provide a clearer picture of the actual location of this fabled mountain.
With satellite infrared photography, there have been major archaeological discoveries found throughout the world. There's a trail that comes down the west branch of the Red Sea. The left-hand branch of it comes down to the tip of the Sinai Peninsula, stops there. It appears to come out the other side, and then wanders north to the highest mountain in the area, Jabal al-Lawz. And we did find what I think is important archaeological evidence that something took place at Jabal al-Lawz.
Larry Williams, who might best be described as an adventurer, as opposed to, say, an archaeologist or scientist, enlisted the services of Robert Cornick, a former policeman with a reputation for bravery, and the two men literally sneaked into Saudi Arabia and made their way to the mountain called Jebel el-Lawz on modern maps, but which 4 years earlier had been described as the real Mount Sinai by amateur archaeologist Ron Wine.
In 1988, we retraced the Exodus route from the tip of the Sinai Peninsula into Saudi Arabia, using the Bible and satellite imagery to find the actual route. Inland, 33 kilometers, we found the bitter springs of Marah mentioned in Exodus 15. This dirt sample from the springs has been chemically analyzed and was found to contain excessive iron and dissolved salts, making it very bitter. Continuing along the route, we came to the clear water springs mentioned in Exodus 15:27. Here, caves were being excavated by Saudi archaeologists. They said they had found the writings in these caves indicating that Moses had come through this area. The tomb of Jethro, the father-in-law of Moses, and Zipporah, the wife of Moses, were found in these caves.
And we did find what I think is important archaeological evidence that something took place at Jabal al-Lawz. We found at the base of this mountain 12 pillars, 18.5 feet in diameter. Why not 7? Why not 11? Why 12? With the 12 tribes of Moses fitting so perfectly into that scenario. Additionally, on the flat in front of this mountain, we found a large pile of rocks about 24 feet tall. There's a petroglyph of an Egyptian, not an Arabic drawing, but an Egyptian drawing of the golden calf. And additionally, at the base of the mountain, we found kind of a wing-shaped formation, foundation pointing towards the mountain, and there we found marble, round marble stones. This is some of the stone of it. This rock is not indigenous to that area of Saudi Arabia, let alone to Saudi Arabia.
An encampment area large enough for an estimated 1 to 2 million people is a major factor in determining the location of the real Mount Sinai, and a source of water for a group that large would be essential for an extended stay of even a month, let alone a year. But the Bible provides other clues as well. How does Jebel el-Lawz measure up in some of these more obscure requirements?
We found the top of the mountain to be black, as if the rocks had been burnt, possibly confirming biblical scripture that the Lord descended upon it in fire and smoke.
Archaeologists have identified another small footnote to the Mount Sinai argument having to do with the tablets of the law, or the Ten Commandments.
Unlike other law codes, such as the Code of Hammurabi, which was written on an 8-foot stela and stood out in the open air, the Ten Commandment tablets were portable and designed to be kept as a sacred treasure. Although ancient Egyptian and Babylonian stelas, tablets, and wall reliefs were usually done in limestone, basalt rock, or diorite, there is strong evidence that the Ten Commandment tablets were done in granite or marble, rock types that are found at the Jebel al-Lawz Mount Sinai site in Saudi Arabia.
Shortly after Cornuke and Williams visited the site, the Saudi government closed down the Jebel el-Lawz site to any foreign archaeological study. They also erected a chain-link fence and placed a military guard around the mountain to prevent even clandestine exploration of the site.
The Saudi government is in a very difficult political position. Because the Saudis had no sense of nationalism when the country was unified in the 1920s, the House of Saud used the theology of the Wahhabi sect of Islam to create national unity. Saudi Arabia is still run largely by a coalition between the royal family and the religious establishment. That religious establishment is very resistant to exploring anything archaeologically before Islam. a period they see as characterized by moral chaos. The other problem the House of Saud faces is external. If it allows archaeological excavations of ancient Israelite sites in Saudi Arabia, the House of Saud opens itself up to the anger of the Arab world.
The evidence for the real Mount Sinai being in Saudi Arabia appears to be overwhelming, but the ancient animosities are still preventing scientists and scholars from uncovering factual evidence that could settle the argument once and for all. And today's modern warriors are adding to the difficulty.
According to Howard Blum, in his book, The Gold of Exodus, any verification of Jebel el-Lawz is going to be very complicated. The mountain is now part of a $5.6 billion Saudi military installation called Operation Peace Shield. It was built with the approval of the U.S. Congress using U.S. contractors and Air Force personnel. Operation Peace Shield was originally designed as a radar installation in order to protect the kingdom against intruders. However, according to Blum, it has since been armed with missiles capable of hitting targets within Israel and Iraq. It is ironic that what some investigators believe to be the true Mount Sinai, the place where the law was given for the preservation of Israel, could potentially be used for the destruction of Israel.
Does this mean, then, that we may never really know whether or not this is the Mount Sinai on which Moses received the Ten Commandments? Or is there some hope for future exploration?
We need permission for a competent, trained archaeologist to go in and excavate and record the material carefully and submit it for review by other scholars, because there are too many gaps in our knowledge.
Whether or not this is proven to be the mountain where Moses stood in awe before the burning bush, there appears to be considerable evidence that Mount Sinai is located somewhere in northwestern Saudi Arabia. And if the Exodus account is true, that mountain will be blackened by heavenly fire. There will be evidence of a large and sometimes boisterous encampment, and perhaps even, as some have suggested, some remnant of the gold and jewels and other personal possessions the fleeing slaves were permitted to take with them. Proof positive of the exact location of Mount Sinai, it seems, is literally hidden behind armed guards of the Saudi government. But the earliest, post-biblical Jewish sources from Palestine, the mid-2nd century Book of Jubilees, fragments of which were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, gives a long and idealized description of world geography that suggests the author believed Mount Sinai to be in the Arabian Peninsula. The clearest description of early Jewish literature of the location of Mount Sinai comes from the 1st century historian Josephus. He wrote that Mount Sinai is the highest of mountains in the region of the city of Madian, towering 8,000 feet above the desert floor. Jebel el-Lawz certainly fits that description. But the sad fact is, in spite of all the evidence that has been accumulated, we really don't know, and indeed can't know for certain until competent archaeological excavations are once again permitted on the mountain itself. But the presence of a large Arab military installation on the mountain brings up an interesting question. If Jebel el-Lawz was proven to be the true Mount Sinai, and the Saudi military was using that strategic position to direct missiles into Israel, would the Israeli government destroy the Mountain of Moses? Something to think about.